The first sound I heard that Monday morning was not a gunshot or a siren. It was the clean, hard click of a tow chain locking under the rear axle of Glenn Barlow's black Buick Roadmaster. Glenn was standing in the rain beside my orchard gate, red in the face, shouting that I was ruining his life, while half of Pine Ridge Estates watched from lawn chairs with paper cups of coffee. The strange part was, 6 months earlier, he had parked that same Buick across my gate and told me, "Real calm and real certain, honey. Nobody owns a road once, enough people need it." My name is Eleanor Carver, but everybody in Masons Fort, Tennessee has called me Nell since I was a girl. And in the fall of 1995, I was 52 years old, 4 years widowed, and tired in the particular way a person gets tired when they've spent too long pretending other people are not trying to take something from them. I owned 28 acres of peach trees, a weathered white farmhouse, a packing shed with a rusted tin roof, and one narrow gravel lane that ran from my front gate to the county highway. That lane had been built by my father in 1948 with a borrowed bulldozer, 2 mules, and the kind of stubbornness that used to count for a lot in rural Tennessee. My daddy called it Carver Lane, though the county map listed it only as Private Access Road 17, which sounded less romantic but had the nice advantage of being legally accurate. For nearly 30 years, that road had carried feed trucks, school buses when the creek flooded, tractor trailers full of peach crates, church ladies bringing casseroles after funerals, and once, in 1979, my husband Bobby's fishing boat after he forgot to lower the motor before pulling out of the lake. It was not a fancy road, not even close, but it was mine, and more importantly, it was the only way in or out of the place my family had worked for 3 generations. Back then, before the trouble started, Masons Fork was the kind of town where people waved from pickup trucks, knew who had gotten a new roof, and could tell from the grocery store parking lot which marriage was having a hard season. The biggest excitement most weeks was the Friday night football game, or whether Mr. Dillard at the hardware store had finally fixed the sign over his awning. Then a developer from Nashville bought the pasture behind my orchard and built Pine Ridge Estates, a tidy little subdivision of 36 homes with white fences, brick mailboxes, and streets named after trees that had been cut down to build them. That development was supposed to have its own entrance from State Route 11, but the bridge contractor went broke halfway through the job. The county got tangled up in permits, and suddenly the residents discovered that Carver Lane was the quickest route to town. At first, it was harmless enough. A minivan here, a teenager cutting through in a pickup there. I let it slide because I knew people were inconvenienced, and because I had spent my whole life being the kind of woman who believed a little patience could keep a small problem from becoming an ugly one. Then Glenn Barlow moved into the biggest house in Pine Ridge Estates, the 2-story brick place with the circular driveway and the fake gas lamps out front. Glenn was 58, owned an insurance office on Main Street, wore golf shirts even when he was not golfing, and had the kind of smile that made you wonder what he had already decided about you before you finished speaking. He became president of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Committee before the paint dried on half the houses. He liked titles. Glenn did. President, chairman, community representative. He put those words on his business cards in letters so shiny you could probably see them from space. The first time we met, he came down Carver Lane in a white polo shirt and loafers that had never touched mud, carrying a folder under one arm. He stood at my gate while I was unloading fertilizer and said, "Mrs. Carver, I am here on behalf of the residents." I told him, "Well, Mr. Barlow, I am right here on behalf of myself, so I guess we can save some time." He smiled like I was supposed to be charming. Then he explained that Pine Ridge needed access through my lane until the new bridge was completed, that the homeowners had children, jobs, appointments, church functions, all the things people have when they want something from you, and that he expected me to cooperate for the good of the community. I said, "Glenn, that road is private, it crosses my orchard, and every truck that uses it tears up gravel I pay for." He opened his folder, took out a photocopy of an old plat map, and tapped it with one polished fingernail. "According to this," he said, "there may be historical access rights." "Maybe," I said, is doing a lot of work in that sentence. He laughed, but there was no warmth in it. "You do not want to make enemies over a road now?" I remember standing there with a fertilizer bag leaking dust onto my boots, looking at that man in his clean shirt and thinking he had no idea what he was talking about. Not about the road and not about me. I still said no politely. That was my first mistake. I thought politeness sounded like strength. To Glenn, it sounded like permission. A week later, a shiny black Buick Roadmaster appeared across my gate at 7:15 in the morning, parked sideways like it had been dropped there by a careless giant. I had a delivery truck due at 8,200 pounds of wooden peach crates coming in from Georgia, and the driver was already calling me from the highway asking where he was supposed to turn. I walked down to the Buick and saw Glenn sitting inside, talking on one of those big cellular phones people carried in black bags back then, looking as pleased with himself as a cat that had discovered an open can of tuna. I knocked on his window. He rolled it down 2 inches. "Morning, Nell," he said. "You are blocking my gate, Glenn. I am waiting on a shipment." He glanced over his shoulder at the gate like he had never noticed it before. "This is temporary," he said. "We are having a Pine Ridge committee meeting at the clubhouse and the parking lot is full." I said, "Then park at the clubhouse, not on my property." He leaned one elbow on the window frame. "Honey, this road serves everybody now. It is practically public." I looked at him for a second and I said, "Well, Glenn, if it is public, maybe the public can help you move your car." He gave me that polished little smile again and said, "You have got a temper for a woman your age. I wish I could tell you I had some clever answer ready." I did not. I just stood there, feeling my face go hot, because men like Glenn know exactly how to make a woman question whether standing up for herself will make her look unreasonable. He left the Buick there for 2 hours. My delivery truck had to wait on the shoulder. The driver lost a morning. I lost money. Glenn lost nothing but a little gas, while he sat in a committee meeting talking about community values. That should have been the day I called a lawyer. Instead, I wrote him a note and put it under his windshield wiper. PR, I vate RO rad. Do not block gate. Next time, I will have the vaticle removed. He took the note, folded it in half, and left it on my porch the next afternoon, with a yellow sticky note attached that read, "Be neighborly." Over the next month, the problem became a pattern, and then the pattern became a campaign. Glenn started telling people the road had always been a public access route. He had teenagers from Pine Ridge driving through my peach rows at night. He put up a hand-painted sign at the entrance that said, "Community cut there," like he'd appointed himself mayor of every inch of dirt between my gate and the highway. I tore it down before breakfast. He put up another one the next day, this time with the Pine Ridge logo in the corner. I took pictures. He began sending me notices on homeowners committee letterhead claiming I owed a road maintenance assessment of $900. I laughed when I read it, then stopped laughing when I realized some of my neighbors had received copies. Suddenly, people who had bought peaches from me for years were looking at me sideways in the feed store. One woman asked if I was refusing emergency access to Pine Ridge families. Another said she heard I had threatened children for riding bicycles on my road. I wanted to scream. Instead, I went home and started a shoebox in the bottom drawer of my desk. In it, I put every letter, every photo, every note, every date and time I wrote down in blue ballpoint pen. I had no cell phone camera, no cloud storage, no magic little device in my pocket that recorded everything. I had a Canyon point-and-shoot camera, a camcorder my daughter had given me for Christmas, 3 VHS tapes, and a stack of Kodak envelopes from the pharmacy. So that is what I used. I filmed Glenn's Buick blocking the gate. I filmed Pine Ridge residents driving through the orchard. I filmed the new sign he put up near my mailbox. I photographed tire tracks in the mud after a construction truck crushed 2 young peach trees near the south fence. I wrote the date on the back of every picture, July 18. July 23, August 2nd, August 9. I kept telling myself it was just paperwork, that I was simply being careful. But deep down I knew I was building a wall because Glenn had already made it clear he respected neither fences nor kindness. Then came the day he crossed a line I could not pretend not to see. My older sister Ruth came to visit from Chattanooga. Ruth was 74, had bad hips, carried a folding cane in the trunk of her Oldsmobile, and still believed every family problem could be fixed with pie. She had not been to the orchard since Bobby died, and I had spent a week cleaning the guest room, baking cornbread, and pretending I was not nervous about seeing her because Ruth had always been the one who could look at me and know exactly what I was not saying. She arrived on a Saturday afternoon in October, just as the leaves were starting to turn the color of old pennies. I drove down to open the gate, and there was Glenn's Buick again, parked dead across the entrance. Not just close to the gate, not half on the shoulder, not something I could quietly work around, dead center. There were folding chairs nearby, a table with lemonade, and about 10 people from Pine Ridge wearing little green ribbons that said "Save OHAV ACCESS." Glenn had arranged a neighborhood meeting in front of my gate like he was holding a town hall on the courthouse lawn. I stood there with Ruth in the passenger seat, her cane folded beside her, and Glenn came walking over with a paper cup in one hand. "Afternoon, Nell," he said. I told him, "Move your car." He smiled. "We are educating the residents about responsible land use." My sister leaned toward the open window and said, "Is this the man who thinks he owns your driveway?" Glenn looked at her, then looked back at me. I said, "Glenn, my sister has arthritis. She needs to get inside. Move the Buick." He took a sip of lemonade. "I cannot just interrupt a community event. You have got a lot of hostility, Nell. You ought to think about how that looks." For a second I saw red, not metaphorically. Everything in front of me seemed to go red around the edges. I wanted to grab that little green ribbon off his chest and throw his lemonade into the gravel. Instead, I walked back to my truck, climbed in, and drove Ruth to the diner in town. We sat in a booth near the window for nearly 3 hours, waiting for Glenn's little meeting to end. Ruth held her coffee with both hands and said nothing at first. Then she said, "Your husband used to tell you to keep the peace because he loved you. But you have been keeping the peace for people who do not love you at all." I looked at her across that vinyl table and started crying so quietly the waitress pretended not to notice. Cal had been Bobby's friend in high school, then became a lawyer after serving in the Navy. And by 1995 he had a small office over the old Western Auto store with a buzzing fluorescent light and a secretary named Shirley who could scare a man into paying a bill just by clearing her throat. I told Cal the whole story. He listened without interrupting, then said, "Nell, do you still have your daddy's deed?" I told him it was in a metal lockbox under the bed. He said, "Good. Bring me everything. The deed, the tax receipts, the pictures, the notices, the VHS tapes, all of it. And Nell, stop arguing with him in the road. Let the record speak louder than either one of you." Part 2. The Midle. The next few weeks were not dramatic in the way television likes dramatic. There were no shouting matches in the rain, no deputies chasing anybody through a field, no music swelling in the background while I stared out a window. There were courthouse records, county maps, faded surveys, property tax rolls, and a lot of time spent sitting in wooden chairs outside offices that smelled like dust and old coffee. Cal found the original 1948 survey map in a county archive drawer, drawn in blue ink on thick yellowed paper. It showed Carver Lane running entirely within my family's property line. It also showed something Glenn had conveniently ignored. The Pine Ridge parcel had its own legal access planned from State Route 11. There was no easement through my orchard, no public right-of-way, no emergency agreement, nothing. The only thing Glenn had was confidence in a photocopier. Cal also found that the Pine Ridge Homeowners Committee was not an official homeowners association at all. Not yet, not legally. It was just a group of residents collecting money and holding meetings in a clubhouse that technically belonged to the unfinished development company. Glenn had been sending assessment notices like he had authority because nobody had challenged him. He was not trying to protect the neighborhood. He was trying to protect the promise he had helped sell people on. You see, Glenn had been working as an insurance agent for the developer. He had told buyers that Pine Ridge would have easy access to town, a nice bridge, clean roads, a safe route for children, all of it. When the bridge project stalled, Carver Lane became the shortcut that kept his little story from falling apart. If I let him take it, he looked like a problem solver. If I refused, he needed me to look selfish. Once I understood that, a strange thing happened. I stopped taking his words personally. Not completely, I am not made of stone, but enough to see him clearly. Glenn was not powerful because he was right. He was powerful because people had been afraid it was easier to agree with him than to check the facts. Cal drafted a letter, short and plain. It stated that Carver Lane was private property, that no public or private easement existed, that unauthorized vehicles were trespassing, and that any car blocking the orchard gate after written notice could be removed by a licensed towing company. We sent one copy to Glenn by certified mail, one copy to the Pine Ridge Committee, one to the county sheriff, and one to the developer's office in Nashville. We posted bright orange Pier I-8 route signs at the entrance and beside the packing shed. I hated doing it. I hated how ugly those signs looked against the trees. But every time I started to feel guilty, I remembered Ruth sitting in that diner booth with her cane beside her, trying not to make me feel bad for being trapped outside my own home. Glenn got the letter on a Thursday. I knew because the green return receipt came back with his signature on it, big and looping like he had signed the Declaration of Independence. On Friday, he came to my porch. I was shelling beans at the kitchen table when I heard his Buick pull in. He knocked twice, then once harder, the way people knock when they think a door belongs to them. I opened it but left the screen closed. Glenn stood there in a tan raincoat, looking less polished than usual. "You are making a mistake, Nell," he said. I told him, "That seems to be your favorite sentence lately." He tried to smile, but it did not land. "The residents are upset. They believe you are punishing them for something the developer did." I said, "I am not punishing anyone. I am protecting my property." He leaned closer to the screen. "You really want to be the old woman who blocks families from getting to town?" I looked at him and said, "I am 52, Glenn, not 112. And if you call me old again, I might start charging you a history lesson." His mouth tightened. "You think you have won because you hired a lawyer?" I said, "No. I think I have won because I owned the road." That was the first time I saw him lose his balance. Not physically. Glenn was too careful to stumble where people could see. But something in his face slipped. He had spent months treating me like a widow with too much land and not enough fight left in her. Now he was looking at a woman who had read the paperwork. He said, "You're going to regret this?" I said, "Probably, but I will regret it from my own driveway." After he left, I sat at the kitchen table shaking so badly I spilled beans all over the floor. That is something people do not talk about when they tell stories about standing up for themselves. You do not always feel brave. Sometimes you feel sick. Sometimes you feel like you have picked up a rock and thrown it at a hornet's nest. But I had reached the point where being afraid of Glenn was starting to cost more than fighting him. The real escalation began 2 days later. Someone cut the chain on my south gate and drove a pickup through the lower orchard. They crushed a row of young peach trees, snapped irrigation pipes, and left beer cans near the creek. I called the sheriff. Deputy Earl Matson came out, a good man with a grey moustache and a slow way of speaking that made people either calm down or get nervous. He looked at the tire tracks, wrote down measurements, and said whoever did this knew exactly where they were going. I asked him if he thought it was Glenn. Earl said, "I think you have a problem with somebody who wants you to believe this will get worse if you do not give in." Then he looked at the orange private road signs and added, "That does not mean you should give in." We did not catch anyone that day, but the next week a teenager from Pine Ridge came to my house with his mother. His name was Ricky, 17 years old, skinny as a fence post, eyes full of the kind of fear boys have when they are trying not to cry. He admitted he had driven through the orchard with 2 friends. He said Glenn had told them the road belonged to the community now, and that he had laughed when somebody suggested I might get mad. Ricky's mother stood behind him with her arms crossed so tight I thought she might snap in half. She said, "Mr. Barlow told these boys you would not do anything because you were all talk." I looked at Ricky, then at his mother, and I did not feel angry. I felt sad. Glenn was not just fighting me. He was teaching people younger than him that rules were for whoever had less money and less noise. I told Ricky he would spend 2 Saturdays helping Ray, my orchard foreman, replace irrigation lines and clean up the damage. His mother nodded before he could speak. When they left, I sat on the porch for a long time, watching the road. I knew then that this would not end with a nice letter. Glenn had gone too far, and worse, he had done it because he thought everyone would be too polite to say so. Cal filed for an emergency injunction after the orchard damage, and the hearing was set for the first Monday in November. Glenn spent the week before it going door to door in Pine Ridge. He told people I was trying to isolate the neighborhood. He said I'd threatened to shut down emergency access. He told one woman I was planning to put a locked steel gate across the road and charge residents money to use it. By Sunday evening, my answering machine had 6 messages, 3 angry, 2 confused, 1 from a woman crying because she had a sick child and was scared she would not be able to get help. That message hurt the most. I called her back and explained that emergency vehicles could always enter through the county service route on the north side of Pine Ridge, the route Glenn never bothered to mention because it was 3 minutes longer. She went quiet and said, "He told us there was no other way." I said, "That is what he wants you to believe." On Monday morning, the courthouse was full. Not just lawyers and clerks, but Pine Ridge residents, a reporter from the Masons Fork Gazette, and a few old men who probably had no idea what was happening, but had heard there might be drama. Glenn arrived in a navy suit with a red tie and a stack of papers under his arm. He looked confident until Cal laid the original survey map on the table. The judge was a woman named Marianne Holt, maybe 60 years old, sharp as a tack, with silver hair pinned back so neatly it looked like she had built it with a ruler. Cal explained the deed. He explained the road. He explained that Glenn's committee had no legal authority over my property. Then he played part of one VHS tape from my camcorder, grainy and a little crooked, but clear enough. There was Glenn in front of my gate standing beside the Buick saying, "This is public now because the people need it." The courtroom got quiet. Glenn's lawyer tried to argue that the phrase was only an expression of community belief. Judge Holt looked over her glasses and said, "Mr. Barlow's community belief does not supersede a recorded deed." I will admit I almost laughed. Not because it was funny exactly, though it was, but because I had waited months for someone in authority to say out loud what I had known all along. The judge granted the injunction. She ordered Glenn and the Pine Ridge Committee to stop using Carver Lane without permission, ordered all unauthorized signs removed, and authorized law enforcement to assist if anyone blocked the gate. Glenn did not look at me when the hearing ended. He walked past with his jaw clenched, and I heard him mutter to his lawyer, "This is not over." I wanted to tell him he was right. It was not over, but it was about to become very public. Part 3. The End. The weekend after the hearing, Glenn called for what he described as a peaceful community gathering at the entrance to Pine Ridge. By then, most people had heard about the court order, but Glenn had a way of turning bad news into a speech. He told residents he was protesting government overreach. He told them an old widow with a lawyer was trying to destroy their neighborhood. He asked them to bring coffee, folding chairs, and signs about freedom. I heard about it from Joni, my daughter, who worked at the diner and knew every piece of gossip before it reached the newspaper. She called me from the payphone behind the counter and said, "Mama, Glenn is planning to make a show of this on Monday morning." I said, "Then I guess I will be there Monday morning." At 5:30 that Monday, I walked down to the gate with a thermos of coffee, my court order folded in my coat pocket, and a calmness I had not felt in a long time. The sky was low and grey. It had rained all night, and the gravel road shone dark beneath the security lights I had installed near the gate. At 5:45, I heard the Buick before I saw it. That deep, smug engine sound came rolling up Carver Lane, and Glenn parked it sideways across my entrance again. He got out wearing a raincoat over his suit, like he had decided he was going to look important no matter what the weather did. Behind him came 2 cars, then 3, then a handful of Pine Ridge residents with umbrellas, thermoses, and handmade signs. One sign said "O Zerabori 2," another said "Community" before G read. I looked at that one for a long moment and thought about the peach trees, the irrigation pipes, the fake assessment notices, the lies about emergency access. Then I looked at Glenn. He saw me standing by the gate and smiled. "Morning, Nell," he said. I said, "Good morning, Glenn. You are blocking my road." He spread his arms toward the crowd. "We are making a statement." I pulled the folded court order from my pocket. "So am I." He glanced at the paper but did not take it. "You are not going to have my car towed in front of everybody." I said, "I do not need to do anything." "You parked it there." At 6 o'clock, Deputy L. Madsen arrived in his patrol car, followed by Hank Lively in his old blue tow truck, the one with the big yellow light on top, and the hand-painted lettering that said, "Lively, Towing and Recovery." Behind Hank came a produce truck from Knoxville, scheduled to pick up my late harvest apples from the packing shed. It was a real delivery, real business, real crates stacked and waiting. Glenn looked at the truck, then at Earl, and for the first time all morning the color left his face. Earl stepped out of the cruiser, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, and walked toward Glenn with the court order in one hand. "Mr. Hare, Barlow," he said, "you've been notified that this is a private road. You are now obstructing access in violation of a court order." Glenn puffed himself up. "This is a peaceful protest." Earl said, "A peaceful protest is not supposed to park a Buick across somebody else's driveway." Glenn pointed at me. "She is using the law to punish an entire neighborhood." I said, "No, Glenn, I am using the law because you kept pretending it did not apply to you." The crowd went quiet. Even the people holding signs seemed unsure where to look. Then Glenn did something I will never forget. He laughed. Not a happy laugh, a small, bitter laugh that sounded like a man realizing his own story had gotten away from him. He looked at the tow truck and said, "Fine. Go ahead. Let everybody see what kind of woman you are." I thought about all the times he had called me selfish, old, hostile, unreasonable. I thought about Ruth waiting in a diner booth, about Ricky replacing irrigation pipes, about my daddy's hands on that old road. Then I said, they are seeing exactly what kind of woman I am. Hank did not rush. That is one thing I appreciated about him. He moved like a man who had been towing cars longer than Glenn had been telling people what to do. He put out the warning lights. He checked the Buick. He hooked the chain beneath the rear axle. The little crowd stood in the rain, quiet except for the sound of the tow winch tightening. Then came that click, the sound I told you about at the beginning, clean and hard and final. Glenn stepped toward Hank and said, "You scratch that car. I will own your business by Friday." Hank looked at him and said, "Mister, I've been threatened by better-dressed men than you." Then he climbed into the tow truck. The Buick lifted slowly, its rear tires hanging above the wet gravel, and for a few seconds it looked almost ridiculous. This big shiny symbol of Glenn's authority dangling behind a blue wrecker like a fish that had finally been caught. Nobody cheered. That is important. There was no applause, no triumphant music, no crowd shouting. Just rain, the low-engine growl of the tow truck, and Glenn standing in the mud watching his car disappear down the lane he had spent 6 months claiming belonged to him. As the Buick cleared the gate, the produce truck rolled through, slow and steady, tires crunching on the gravel. Ray came out of the packing shed and raised one hand at me. The driver gave a little honk. It was the most ordinary sound in the world, but it felt like church bells. The crowd began to break apart after that. Some people folded their signs and carried them quietly back to their cars. Others stayed behind, looking embarrassed. One woman named Marlene, who had sent me an angry answering machine message the week before, came over and said, "I am sorry, Nell. We thought he was telling us the truth." I looked at her and said, "I know, that was the whole problem." Glenn tried to fight the court order for another month. He hired a lawyer from Nashville. He sent letters to the county. He accused me of harassment, discrimination, obstruction, pretty much every word he could find that sounded expensive. But the facts were not on his side, and facts are stubborn things when you keep them in a shoebox long enough. The county made Pine Ridge remove its fake access signs. The developer finally repaired the bridge route from State Route 11. The committee members voted Glenn out after they found out he had used their collected maintenance money to pay for legal fees and a private survey that supported nothing. His insurance office did not close, but it got quieter. People in Mason's Fork remembered things. They remembered promises he had made. They remembered how he talked to women at meetings. They remembered how fast he had been willing to turn a widow into a villain because he wanted a shortcut. I did not celebrate his downfall. Not really. I had known Glenn before all this, the way you know somebody in a small town. I knew he had a wife named Donna who collected antique salt shakers. I knew he had a son working in Atlanta. I knew he had once donated uniforms to the Little League team. People are rarely only one thing, and I do not think anybody wakes up planning to become the bad guy in somebody else's story. But Glenn had chosen over and over again to treat my patience as weakness. He had chosen to tell lies because the truth was inconvenient. He had chosen to make a private road into a public battlefield because he could not stand being told no. And in the end, the thing that beat him was not rage. It was not revenge. It was paper, film, dates, signatures, and one old blue tow truck that showed up exactly when it was supposed to. That Thanksgiving, Ruth came back to the orchard. This time, her Oldsmobile rolled right through the gate. No Buick, no folding chairs, no signs, just wet leaves on the gravel and the smell of apples cooling in the packing shed. She stepped out with her cane, looked around and said, "Well, I see the road finally learned who it belongs to." I laughed so hard I had to lean against the truck. We ate pie on the porch while the sun went down over the orchard. Later, after Ruth had gone to bed, I walked to the gate alone. The new private road sign reflected in the headlights from the house. I put my hand on the wood post and thought about Bobby, my daddy, the years I had spent trying to be agreeable, the months I had spent feeling small in my own home. I used to think keeping the peace meant never making anyone uncomfortable. I do not think that anymore. Sometimes peace means drawing a line and standing there quietly until everybody else understands it is not moving. Now, I want to ask you something, because people still argue about what happened that morning. Some folks say I embarrassed Glenn too publicly, that I should have found another way, that towing his car in front of his neighbors was harsh even if he had earned it. Other people say I waited far too long, that the first time he blocked my gate I should have had that Buick hauled away before lunch. So what do you think? Was I right to let the court order and the tow truck do the talking? Or did I cross a line trying to protect my own? Tell me in the comments, and if you have ever had somebody mistake your patience for permission, share your story too. Because sometimes the people who need to hear these lessons are already standing in somebody else's driveway.